Looking for signs of life. Story.
One day, on January 1, 1850, the cave on the gorge between the Deer and Mill Creeks. The sun filtered through the snow hole at the top of the cave entrance. Mirabal had been careful to keep it open during the days of the blizzard to let fresh air in. Bright beams of sunlight played over her face now. She yawned and rubbed her eyes. Her first thought was that she had slept late, but a second thought rushed up and crowded out the first. The snow had stopped. 2 blizzards back-to-back had blocked in the cave in Maribor for a week. There could not be a third one, not so soon, at least. Maribor took her knife and poked open the snow hole a bit wider in order to see out better. In the morning sun, the white world sparkled like an immense jewel. To the south and west, bare, windswept ridges rose like ranks of ever-breaking waves. The mountain forest was sheathed in snow and morning light. Pine trees bristled with a million icy needles. The oak's branching limbs, blazing in the sunshine, appeared like ice lace in the winter stillness. The sharp whiteness of the air pierced Mirabal's nostrils and stung her cheeks. She was eager to be out. There was much to do.
But first the mark. Maribor took a flake of obsidian she'd found near the cave and scratched a line on the wall. It had been 3 weeks, not since Goodenough had left, that had been 7, not since her father had died, that had been 6, but 3 weeks since she had left the blood-splattered tent and found this cave. It must be the 1st of January, according to Maribor's calculations. The 1st of January, she thought. I'm 15. How much longer until a real thaw? Until the last of the storms? She rekindled the fire. There was still some dough soup from the hindquarters she had wrested from the birds. In the few days of grace after she had left the tent and before the blizzards, Maribor had found a cache of acorns hidden in a tree hollow in a tightly woven basket. Maribor would never have thought of eating acorns, but the fact that they were in a basket suggested that someone had thought of them as food. Also in the basket were some camas and tiger lily roots, something else she had never thought of eating. She experimented carefully in eating these new things. She remembered that Mrs. Grant had told her that many things were poisonous when eaten raw, but not when boiled slowly. So after a long cooking time, Maribor would take little bites of the new food. If it tasted all right, she would eat a little more, attentive to any effects. Acorns became her favorite. In the week of captivity, she had devised different methods for cooking them. They were very good roasted and eaten whole, which was the quickest and easiest way. But their flavor was best when she simmered them slowly, then ground them into a paste and added some of the sweet birch bark from Mrs. Grant's basket. The inner bark was especially sweet, and this took the edge off the slight bitterness of the acorns. If acorns tasted so good, she reasoned, there might be other nuts and perhaps even seeds that she could enjoy. So she was eager to get out this morning and look. Besides, she felt odd about taking from the basket. It was so clearly somebody else's supply, and the idea of gathering nuts was more appealing than probing the snow for oxen or mule carcasses from wagon trains. It was as if on that bloody night when she had walked out of the tent, taking only what she needed on the sledge, she had left behind a fundamental way of living. The former resources seemed as fragile and unsustaining as the old dreams. It was all fool's gold. Since she had been eating the acorns and boiled roots, she had felt much less hungry than in the days back in the tent when she had been eating squirrel and mouse. Not once since being in the cave had she experienced that peculiar sensation of feeling her skull become paper thin, almost transparent, as if the cavity were bright with too much light. Indeed, Maribor had often felt as though she were outside her body and peering into her own skull. She had not felt that way in days.
In a grove of oaks, she dug down under the snow for the acorns. Some were rotten from the dampness, but she found a number of good ones. Nearby, she also found hazelnuts and buckeyes. Spotting a small winter bird pecking at a pine cone for its nuts, she decided to try some of these also. Although autumn was the time for gathering nuts, and many of Maribor's appeared rotten, she had found ways of peeling away the bad parts, trying them slowly in the heat of warm ashes, and then roasting them to make them palatable. She headed now on her snowshoes for a grove of birch trees that she remembered. She stopped on a bare crest of hill to take off the hood that she had made from the pelt of a squirrel that Goodenough had shot. The snow had never been able to gather on the windswept crest, but an ice lip had formed on its edge. Maribor looked at the glistening rim of ice. ice burn, she thought as she saw the patches of scorched grass beneath the ice. She had seen this before on the ridges of the gorge, which were often swept bare of snow by the wind. The ice acted as a magnifying glass to scorch whatever grew beneath it. The nurturing warmth of the sun was turned into a fire by the ice. What was supposed to nourish instead consumed. It was an odd act of nature that fascinated Maribel. As she stared down at the icy crest, something caught her eye. Bright and red as jewels, they sparkled under the ice on a cushion of scorched grass. "Raspberries!" she cried and dropped to her knees. She took out her knife and chipped through the ice. Raspberries for her birthday! The berries were plump and ripe. In another hour they would have been burned. There were perhaps 3 handfuls, which she ate right there. They were not meant to be saved. They were meant to be eaten there, straddling that thin silver rim of ice at the top of a new world. With the sweet juice of a miracle in her mouth, Maribel looked out toward the march of snowy peaks. That night by her fire, she thought about the raspberries. She could still taste their sweetness. No summer berry would ever taste as sweet. She would always have the taste of these, clinging and more real than a memory. She began to think about things that cling. Her father. He was gone, but yet she lived with him, seeing his face, hearing his voice. It was as if he were still there with her, a presence streaming through the minutes of her life like a current in a river. Miracles, Maribel decided, were not meant to be pondered too hard or studied too deeply. They just happened, and one felt blessed by them. The next morning, the sun poured into the cave, and Maribel, feeling warm and still blessed, looked over at her substantial cache of nuts. She decided that perhaps she should replenish the woven basket in the tree hollow. She set out immediately after her breakfast of acorn mush sprinkled with pine nuts, a new flavor that she liked as much as the acorns. The snow nearly reached the lower edge of the tree hollow, but the basket was still there. Maribel had not realized before how lovely the basket was. Not only was it tightly woven, but beautifully shaped into an almost perfect oval with elaborate designs. When she reached into it to put in her acorns, she gasped. The basket had been refilled, and this time there were more camas roots and dried apples. This was meant to be pondered. There had been evidence of Indians everywhere between Mill Creek and Deer Creek. Especially since she had left the tent to come to the cave, Maribel had seen many signs. Obsidian chips from tool-making, heavy flat stones used for grinding.
Maribel had seen earlier of the California Indians just after they had crossed Fandango Pass. She realized that these Indians were different from the ones of the plains. She and Goodnow had talked about these differences. The Pitt River Indians, which included the Mill Creeks of this region and those to the north and east where the Pitt River originated, were neither painted nor befeathered. They seemed to blend in with the forests and rugged terrain in which they lived. Unlike the Plains Indians, they sought no contact with the emigrants for either trade or confrontation. Withdrawal seemed to be their pattern. Very rarely was a Mill Creek Indian ever seen by a white person, and yet they seemed to have the run of the gorges, the hills, and the forests between the Mill and Deer Creeks. Maribel was stunned now as she stood holding the dried apples and camas roots in her hands. A clear sign had been given. A contact of sorts had been made. What did it mean? Each day the basket was replenished in a small way. A root, a piece of dried deer meat or salmon, some nuts. Maribel continued to look for her own food sources. She did not feel it right to take everything from the basket or to become reliant solely on her secret benefactor. The notion of total reliance on anyone except herself was becoming an alien one to Maribel. But she did continue to visit the tree hollow almost daily, never, however, catching a glimpse of the basket's replenisher. Between the basket and Maribel's own successes in finding nuts, food was not the problem that it had been several weeks before. There were, however, 2 other problems. The first was that of making fire. Maribel had 15 matches left for starting her fire. She tried hard to keep the coals going, but when she was out gathering, they often died. Maribel knew no other way to start a fire than by striking a match. She had heard that Indians rubbed sticks together until they smoked or sparks flew, but to Maribel this seemed like a magic reserved for Indians alone. The second problem was loneliness.
As Miraba's hunger diminished, her sense of loneliness increased. Questions of survival had occupied most of Miraba's time. As she grew more proficient at the tasks of survival and more a master of her cave forest world, she had more time to think about things other than keeping her stomach full, her body warm, and the cave safe from predators. Miraba came to realize that simply to survive was not enough for her. There were periods of loneliness, of need for human conversation that were as acute as hunger pangs. She missed her father, and she missed Goodnow. Their conversations had blazed as warmly as any fire. She yearned to share a thought, a word, a sunset with another person, not just any person, but one who could respond in kind. To Miraba's mind, the first problem was more solvable. There had to be another way to start a fire, and she was determined to do it one mid-January morning, as she looked out the cave and saw a light drizzle veiling the forest and gorge, for she was sure it would take more than a single match to start her fire. She really had to give the Indian method a try. There was all to gain and no matches to lose. Perhaps it was not so magical. Miraba began rubbing some dry kindling sticks together. After 5 minutes, she had a small pile of nicely shredded wood. After 10 minutes, she had 2 broken sticks, and she was considerably irritated. What would she do? There had to be a way of starting a fire without matches. She picked up 2 more sticks. She would change her rhythm and the length of her strokes. She had not rubbed 10 strokes before the stick snapped. "Oh no," she muttered. She looked up out of the cave and grimaced. It might have been a full 15 seconds that Miraba stared out the cave pondering the problem when she realized suddenly that there was another human being staring back. Her first problem was unsolved. Her second one, the incredible loneliness that gnawed like hunger, might be over.
The young woman seemed to have grown out of the trees, which she stood among so noiselessly. Her copper skin, her skirt of shredded bark, and the dark fur cape all made her indistinguishable from the textures and colors of the forest. Miraba hardly breathed as she looked upon the Indian woman. She was human, yet she seemed to be of another order. The woman was at the cave opening. Her damp, woody fragrance washed over Miraba, and Miraba felt her own heart beat wildly. At last she was not alone. Miraba savored that human face, the first she had seen in almost 2 months as a starving person would savor food. The Indian woman's face was bathed in Miraba's joyous gaze. The woman looked about the cave. Her eyes settled on a flat piece of wood. She picked it up. Then, sorting through Miraba's kindling, she picked out a straight stick of cedar. She dropped to her knees by the fire pit and motioned for Miraba to sit beside her. From a small fur pouch, the woman took an obsidian knife with a pointed end. She quickly gouged out a socket 1/4 of an inch deep in the flat piece of wood. She notched the edge of the socket and cut a shallow channel between it and the edge of the flat piece of wood. Miraba watched with rapt attention as the woman deftly chiseled and refashioned the wood. When she finally finished, she looked up and smiled. "Muli," she said. It was the first word that Miraba had heard spoken by another human being since the last day at the tent. The sound was exquisite in her ears, a soft, honeyed oval of a sound. She wished that the woman would say it again. She leaned toward the Indian and tried to repeat it. "Muli," she said once more. "Muli," said Miraba. The woman smiled and nodded vigorously. Miraba wondered what the word meant. The woman was now tapping her chest lightly and saying the word "muli" again. She pointed toward Miraba and said the word. Miraba was still befuddled. Was this the woman's name? Was she supposed to say her name too? "Miraba," she said, pointing to herself. The woman now looked perplexed. She shook her head as if to say that this wasn't Miraba's name. "Muli," she pointed to Miraba. "Muli," she pointed to herself. Suddenly, Miraba understood. "Woman," she exclaimed. "Yes, you're woman. I'm woman." The Indian woman nodded excitedly and now repeated the English word fairly closely and held up the flat piece of wood. The woman nodded again. Then she put the two pieces together. "Siwini," she said. She pointed to the other pieces of wood in Meriba's kindling. "Wood," Meriba whispered, and then repeated the woman's word for it, "Siwini." The woman again nodded and directed Meriba to watch. She took some pine needles from a pouch, then crumbled some bark from a log and placed it in the notch and along the channel of the flat piece of wood, as well as on the ground near the channel's runoff. Squatting, she held both ends of the flat piece of wood steady against the ground with her feet. Then she placed the cedar stick upright, the larger end in the socket. Holding the stick between her palms, she began to run them together back and forth in opposite directions. With each motion, the stick rotated to the right and then the left. Her hands bore down, pressing the twirling stick into the socket. Small bits of wood were ground off the sides of the socket, making a wood powder. Meriba's eyes widened as she saw the powder turn brown and begin to smoke. The woman twirled the stick faster, coaxing the smoke from the powder. The powder turned darker and darker, and more smoke came. The accumulating wood powder began to seep down the channel to the edge of the flat piece of wood. The woman worked even faster, keeping the stick in a twirling fury until a tiny spark glowed in the powdered wood. The spark formed just at the notch of the socket, where it traveled down the channel to the tinder at its end on the ground. "Auna!" the woman exclaimed as the first lick of flame consumed the pine needles. She added some more and blew gently on the newborn fire. It had taken the woman less than 10 minutes to make the fire, but Meriba felt as if she had been in some dream world, witnessing the most extraordinary fantasy for the last half hour. It had barely been that long since she had looked up from her own pathetic efforts at fire-making and spotted the woman. Since that moment, it seemed to Meriba that the entire world had changed. Fire had been made, new words had been spoken, and most extraordinary of all, she was no longer alone.
No Escort story.
Tim Meeker felt a confused mixture of awe, envy, and disapproval when his older brother Sam, 16, ran off to fight against the British. Tim had to stay home and help with the chores. The older Meekers, loyal to the King of England despite taxation without representation and other problems of being ruled by the distant English king, tried to keep away from the conflict. Yet the War of Independence intruded on their lives in many ways. Food became scarce, all weapons were taken from citizens, and around their quiet New England village they couldn't help hearing the sounds of gunfire and seeing the processions of wounded, crippled soldiers. In order to survive through the winter of 1775, Mr. Meeker and Tim needed to sell some cattle, but first they had to cross dangerous territory where armed robbers hid, waiting for unprotected travelers. On a cold November evening, as he proceeded nervously with his father and the wagon load of supplies through the darkening woods toward home, Tim got a chance to prove his bravery. When I woke up in the morning, it had stopped snowing and the sun was shining. Water was running in small streams off the roof. It was pretty, everything a foot deep in snow and the sun sparkling off the fields. But even though it was pretty, I didn't like it. Plowing through snow a foot deep with the ox cart all the way back to Reading was going to be miserable work. Our feet would get soaked right away and stay wet and cold all day long, and as the snow got warm and then chopped up by the oxen, we'd find ourselves stumbling around in a slippery mixture of mud and snow. Mrs. Plott gave us a breakfast of biscuits and gravy. We said goodbye to everybody, hitched up the oxen, and pulled out of the yard onto the road. "Are we going to have an escort?" I asked Father. "I don't know," he said. "Plott rode out last night to arrange for one, but with the snow, people may not want to ride. But that works two ways. The raiders may not want to ride either. You work the oxen, I'm going to ride on ahead." So that's how it went. Father would ride a mile or two, and then ride back to see how I was doing. And then he'd ride out again. That way, if he ran into the cowboys, he could race back to me and we could find a place to hide. If you hear me shout, don't wait. Run for the nearest piece of woods you see. They won't come into the woods on horseback in the snow.
The only trouble with this plan was that there usually weren't any woods close to the road. Most of the farmers had used up the trees near their houses and had their woodlots on backland. But still there were patches of woods here and there, so as I plowed along through the snow, I kept looking for woodlots to run to if something happened. It wasn't going to be easy running in that snow, though. But there was nothing to do about it but push on. The oxen were more willing to pull than they had been the day before. It was warm enough and there was no snow blowing in their faces. But they kept slipping, especially on the hills, and I would have to tug and pull at them to keep them going forward. I was alone most of the time because Father was out of sight somewhere up the road. In the snow, Gray made very little noise so that I couldn't hear him coming. Every once in a while, Father would surprise me by riding silently into sight. He'd wave and I'd wave back to let him know that everything was all right, and he'd ride away again. I didn't like being alone so much. Suppose the cowboys came suddenly up behind me, or suppose they were hiding in one of the houses or barns along the side of the road. They'd get to me before I could run. As I slogged along, I kept turning around and looking down the road behind me, trying to see around corners and through clumps of trees. About every
Minutes I would imagine I was hearing horses and jump around ready to run for it. Then I would look up and there would be nothing but the empty white sheet lying over the fields and hills. At lunchtime, Father came back. We sat in the wagon, drank some hard cider, and ate some biscuits. Ridgeberry is about 2 miles up ahead, he said. I'll ride through this place. He shook his head. We might as well push on and get it over with, Tim, he said. Bear up, it won't last forever. We got through Ridgeberry all right. Some people came to the inn door and stared at us as we went through. I guess they thought it queer to see us trying to travel in that snow. Father looked grim. If nobody knew we were around before, they do now, he said. Then we got out of the village and he rode on ahead again, scouting. My feet were wet and cold and I was still hungry. Biscuits and cider don't make much of a lunch when you're working oxen along. To keep my mind off my troubles, I began trying to name all the countries in the world, which I was supposed to know because I'd learned them in geography. Some were easy to name: England, France, Sweden, Russia. But there were all those little hard ones like Hesse and Tuscany and Piedmont. It took me a while to decide if I could count America or not. If the rebels won the war, then we would be a country. But Father was sure we were going to lose, so I decided not to count us. Another trouble was keeping them all straight in my head. After I got over 20, I'd sometimes forget whether I'd already counted Serbia or India or someplace, and have to go back over the whole list again. And I was trying to figure out whether or not I'd counted Arabia when it suddenly hit me that I hadn't seen Father for a long, long time. I was shocked. How long had it been since the last time he had ridden silently into sight? I couldn't tell. It seemed like it had to be half an hour at least, maybe an hour. I jumped up onto the wagon and looked back across the white countryside, trying to get a feeling of how far I'd come since I last saw him. All I could see was white. A few clumps of trees, a couple of farmhouses, and the muddy black trail of the ox cart winding through it. Where had I been when I last saw Father? I couldn't remember. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it had only seemed like a long time. Maybe being involved with listing all those countries gave me a funny idea of time. But I didn't believe it. We'd come a long way, as far back over the hills as I could see, and that was a couple of miles. Now I was really getting worried. Of course, there were a lot of simple explanations. Father could have met somebody he knew and started talking, or he could have gone off somewhere to look for an escort, or he could have stopped at a farmhouse to get us something warm to eat. There were a lot of explanations, but I knew none of them were true. If he'd been planning to leave me alone for a while, he would have told me. He wouldn't have left me by myself this long, he just wouldn't have done it. So then what? Perhaps something had happened to Gray. He could easily have tripped in the snow and hurt himself. Maybe Father got hurt in the accident too. Maybe he twisted an ankle or even broke his leg. No matter what it was, the important thing was for me to catch up to him quickly. I belted the oxen across their rumps with my stick. They grunted and shivered their heads and picked up the pace a little, but 5 minutes later they had slowed down. I hit them again, this time harder. They went faster, but hardly for more than a minute or two. They couldn't go much faster because of the snow, and even if they could, they just weren't going to. They weren't horses, they were oxen, and they just plain didn't move fast. That worried me some more. If Gray had slipped, Father might have been badly hurt. He might be bleeding or even lying unconscious in the snow. And to tell the truth, I was feeling scared and lonely without him. I wanted to find him. So I pulled the oxen as far off to the side of the road as I could, kicked away snow so they could find some weeds to graze on, and started plowing on up the road as quickly as I could. It was easy enough to follow Gray's tracks.
Nobody else had been along the road but Father. It was hard trying to jog in the snow, and I began to sweat. Every few minutes I stopped to rest and have a look ahead. If there was a rock or a high stump by the roadside, I would climb up to that and look on ahead. But all I saw were the horse tracks running on and on. I went on like this for around 15 minutes, covering a good mile and maybe even more, when I saw a patch of hemlocks bordering the left-hand side of the road. There was a farmhouse on the hillside behind them. Perhaps Father had gone in there for food or something. I considered cutting off the road across the field to go directly to the farmhouse, but then I decided I better stick to following the horse tracks in case. I plowed on until I came to where the hemlocks began to border the road, casting a cool shadow on the snow. There it was written out for me to see as plain as if I was reading it in a book. The road was all a turmoil of mud and snow marked with dozens of hoofprints. There were more hoofprints in the hemlock grove, and then going on up the road away from me, the tracks of 3 or 4 horses. The cowboys had lain in ambush in the hemlock groves, jumped Father, and taken him away someplace. I stood there in the snow trying to think, but my mind just stopped working. All I could think was that Father was gone. I began silently to pray, "Oh please, God, oh please." Then suddenly I realized that the cowboys might be still around, hiding somewhere and watching me. My neck began to prickle and I swung around and stared off across the fields, then back to the hemlocks. There was nobody. All was silence.
No sound of horses, no sound of people talking, no sound of anything but a faint wind breathing in the tops of the hemlocks. Why hadn't they come back for the wagon? Perhaps Father had got them to believe some story, or perhaps they were going to do something with him first and then come after me in the wagon. What I wanted to do was start running and not stop until I got home. It wasn't more than 12 or 15 miles. I could make it in 3 hours if I pushed. I was scared, that was the truth. It felt so lonely to be by myself with Father gone and maybe dead and nobody but myself to do whatever had to be done. I was too scared even to cry. I just felt frozen and unable to move or think of what I should do next. But finally, I told myself that I had to stop being scared. I had to stop just standing there in the middle of the road. To get myself shaken awake, I jumped up and down a few times and clapped my hands. That unfroze me a little, and I began to think. The first thing I did was duck back into the hemlocks to hide in case somebody came along. Then I asked myself what Sam would do if it were him, because he'd be brave and smart and do the right thing. And of course, Sam wouldn't go running home. He'd do something daring. The most daring thing to do would be to track down Father, which wouldn't be too hard in the snow, and rescue him. That would be daring, all right. I didn't have a gun, didn't have a sword or anything but a knife and a stick. Then it came to me that even though rescuing Father was the daring thing to do, it wasn't the smartest thing. So I asked myself another question. What would Father do? And the answer that came pretty quickly was that he'd get the oxen and the wagon and the load of goods back home, if he could, so we'd have something to run the store on through the winter. When I thought about it for a minute more, I could see that it was the right answer. Maybe Father would get away. The cowboys might even let him go after a while. One way or another, he would be counting on me to get the wagon home. That was for certain. I jumped out of the hemlock grove and started jogging back toward the wagon. The oxen wouldn't have strayed. Oxen don't wander when they're attached to a heavy wagon. The only risk was that somebody had come along and stolen them or made off with the goods. I went along as fast as I could, all the while looking around for signs of people. But there was nobody, and in a few minutes I got back to the wagon. Everything was all right. I picked up my stick, banged the oxen on their rumps, and they heaved and grunted and stirred it off. There wasn't much point any longer listening for the cowboys. I was pretty certain they'd be along sooner or later, after they'd done whatever they were going to do with Father. What I had to do was figure out some way of persuading them to leave me and the wagon load alone. I could always run up into the fields to save myself, but the point was to try to get the wagon home so we could earn our livelihood through the winter. About half an hour later, I came to the hemlock grove and the place along the road where they'd captured Father. Now I began to watch ahead for tracks leading off to the sides of the road where cowboys might ambush me. But I didn't see anything, and on I went, trying to think of a good story for the cowboys when they came. The sun was beginning to get down in the sky behind me. It would be getting dark soon. Already it was getting cold, and a bit of a chill wind was springing up. I was just as glad of the dark, though. There were houses to pass by and little villages to go through, and in the dark it would be safer. I planned not to stop for the night, but just push on all the way home. Besides, I didn't know of any place to stop. Father had friends along the way, but they were strangers to me. I went on thinking about something to tell the cowboys, and after a while, I began to get an idea. On I went, belting the oxen when they slowed down. The sun dropped behind the hills in back of me, leaving a red smear on the sky, which slowly turned black. I shivered. I was hungry. There were some more biscuits and jerked beef in a sack in the wagon, and a bottle of hard cider Mr. Bogardus had given Father for a present. The cider would warm me up a bit. But I decided not to eat or drink anything yet. I knew I was going to be really tired and cold and miserable soon enough, and it would be nice to have the food and cider to look forward to. I was thinking about the hard cider when I saw the cowboys. They were sitting on horseback in the middle of the road about 20 yards ahead of me. 3 dark figures stalk still in the night. The sight of those unmoving figures shocked me and I almost ran. But I didn't. Instead, I slapped the oxen on their rumps as if I didn't have any worries about who was standing in the middle of the road. One of the horses stomped and his bridle jingled in the night. I cleared my throat quietly so I wouldn't sound scared. Then I shouted, "Are you the escort? Am I ever glad to see you?" One of them pulled the cover off the lantern he had been holding. A circle of hazy light spilled out into the night, showing bits of horses and faces and guns and the trampled snow. "Pull up the oxen," the man with the lantern shouted. I stopped the oxen up and walked forward a few paces. Then the man with the lantern leaned forward to let the light shine on me. "It's the boy," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "Father said that the escort would be along soon, but when you didn't come, I was worried that the cowboys would get to me first." "We're not the—" one of them started to say. "Shut up, Carter," the man with the lantern said. "Come here, boy."
I took a couple of steps forward. Now the lantern was shining in my eyes, and it was hard for me to look up and see their expressions. All I could see was the horse's legs in the snow. The man's voice just came out of the glare. "When did your father say we'd be here?" "He figured you'd be here an hour ago. That's why I was so worried. He told me not to worry, but I couldn't help it. He said that when the shooting started to fall flat and I'd be all right." I paused. "I thought there'd be more of you, though. Father said there'd be at least a half-dozen men in the escort. He said just fall flat when the shooting started." There was silence, and then one of the others said, "I don't like this. It sounds like an ambush." The man with the lantern swung around a bit to face him. "Are you going to get scared off by a boy's story?" "What, sir?" I said. "Never mind, boy." "Do you have anything to eat, sir?" "Shut up, boy." "I don't like this. Let's go." The man raised the lantern to look at the others. Now I could see their faces a little. Well, they looked tough, unshaven and dirty, wearing swords and pistols and muskets tucked in behind their saddles. "Are both of you going to be scared off by a boy's story?" he snarled. "I still don't like it. How do you know it's a story?" "Oh, stop being a couple of babies." "It isn't worth the risk, Judson. Let's leave." "Not worth the risk. There's 100 pounds worth of stuff in that wagon." "Judson, stealing is a hanging matter. I don't want to—" Just then, a dog barked in the distance. The oxen bawled. "It's them." "It's just a dog barking," Judson shouted. "I'm not taking the chance." He wheeled his horse in the snow, and the other did likewise. They had begun to gallop off through the snow. Snarling, Judson pulled the cover over the lantern, and then he wheeled his horse too and disappeared down the road. I stood for a moment listening to the sound of their hooves dying out in the snowy road, and then I began to laugh and cry all at once. My hands shook so hard I dropped my stick, and my knees were so weak I could hardly walk. I felt terrific because I'd fooled them. It would be a great story to tell Sam. But everything else was awful. Father being gone, and me being alone in the snow and dark and hours to go before I got home. I climbed into the wagon and ate the biscuits and beef, and drank about half the bottle of hard cider. I guess I was sort of numb because I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, and by midnight I was home.
Creature of the Snows. Story.
When his boss asked him to climb a Himalayan mountain peak of roughly 23,000 feet to photograph erect-walking creatures where there should not have been any, Ed McKale had strong misgivings. After all, the glider pilot who had reported seeing these creatures and who had taken blurred photographs of them could have been less than honest. Nevertheless, Ed set out on a 2-month expedition with a group that included the leader, Dr. Schenk, who was a specialist in zoology, a couple of expert mountain climbers with Himalayan backgrounds, and several Sherpa porters. Now the 2 months were over and the group had seen nothing unusual. Dr. Schenk was about to declare the expedition completed. He feared that if they stayed, the monsoons would bit them with disastrous results. Ed, on the other hand, wanted to investigate just one more plateau, which he felt was the key to what they had been searching for. It was only now, when faced with the possibility of leaving, that Ed was beginning to believe the glider pilot's story. "There must be some basis of fact in those stories," Ed said to Dr. Schenk. "I've given them a lot of thought. Has it occurred to you that every one of the sightings, the few face-to-face meetings of the natives, and these unknowns, has generally been just around dawn and usually when the native was alone?" Schenk smiled dubiously. "Whatever this creature may be, and I'm convinced that it's either a species of large bear or one of the great anthropoids, it certainly must keep off the well-traveled routes. There are very few passes through these peaks, of course, and it would be quite simple for them to avoid these." "But we're not on any known trail," Ed said doubtfully. "I believe our methods have been all wrong, stringing out a bunch of men looking for trails in the snow. All we've done is announce our presence to anything with ears for miles around. That glider pilot made no sound. He came on them without warning." Ed looked intently at Schenk. "I'd like to try that peak up ahead and the plateau beyond." When Schenk uttered a protesting cry, Ed said, "Wait, this time I'll go alone, with just one Sherpa guide. We could leave several hours before daybreak, no equipment other than oxygen, food for one meal, and my cameras, of course. Maintain a strict silence. We could be back before noon. Will you wait long enough for this one last try?" Schenk hesitated. "Only a few hours more," Ed urged. Schenk stared at him. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed. But aren't you forgetting the most important item of all?" When Ed looked blank, Schenk smiled. "The gas gun. If you should run across one, we'll need more proof than just your word for it." There was very little wind, no moon, but cold, the cold approaching that of outer space, as Ed and one Sherpa porter started away from the sleeping camp, up the shrouded floor of an ice river that swept down from the jagged peak ahead. They moved up, hearing only the squeak of equipment, the peculiar gritty sound of crampons biting into packed snow, an occasional hollow crash of falling ice blocks. To the east already a faint line of gray was visible. Daylight was hours away, but at this tremendous height, sunrise came early. They moved slowly, the thin air cutting cruelly into their lungs, moving up, up. They stopped once for hot chocolate from a vacuum bottle. Ed slapped the Sherpa's shoulder, grinning, pointing ahead to where the jagged peak glowed pink and gold in the first slanting rays of the sun. The Sherpa looked at the peak and quickly shifted his glance to the sky. He gave a long, careful look at the gathering clouds in the east, then muttered something, shaking his head, pointing back down to where the camp was hidden in the inky shadows of enormous boulders. When Ed resumed the climb, the Sherpa removed the long nylon line which had joined them. The route was now comparatively level, on a huge sweeping expanse of snow-covered glacier that flowed about at the base of the peak. The Sherpa, no longer in the lead, began dropping behind as Ed pressed eagerly forward. The sun was up, and with it the wind began keening again, bitterly sharp, bringing with it a scent of coming snow. In the east, beyond the jagged peak just ahead, the immense Himalayas were lost in approaching cloud. Ed hurried as best he could. It would snow, and soon. He'd have to make better time. But above, the sky was blue, infinitely blue, and behind the sun was well up, although the camp was still lost in night below. The peak thrust up ahead, near, with what appeared to be a natural pass skirting its flank. Ed made for it. As he circled a ridge of reddish, rotten rock, he glanced ahead. The plateau spread out before him, gently sloping,
a natural amphitheater, full of deep, smooth snow, with peaks surrounding it, and the central peak thrusting a long black shadow directly across the center. He paused, glancing back. The Sherpa had stopped, well below him, his face a dark blur, looking up, gesticulating frantically, pointing to the clouds. Ed motioned, then moved around, leaning against the rock, peering ahead. The great shadow against the snow was certainly similar to the one in the photo, only it pointed west now. But later it would shift northwest as the sun swung to the south. He stared, squinting against the rising wind that seemed to blow from Earth's outermost reaches. 3 figures stirred slightly and suddenly leaped into focus, almost perfectly camouflaged against the snow and wind-blasted rock. 3 figures, not more than 100 feet below him. 2 small, 1 larger. He leaned forward, his heart thudding terribly at this 20,000-foot height. A tremor of excitement shook him. It was true. They existed. He was looking at what was undeniably a female and 2 smaller, apes. They were covered with downy hair, nearly white, resembling nothing so much as tight-fitting leotards. The female was exactly like any woman on Earth, except for the hair. No larger than most women, with arms slightly longer, more muscular, legs out of proportion to the trunk, shorter. Not apes. Hardly breathing, Ed squinted, staring, motionless. Not apes. Not standing so erectly, not with those broad, high brows. Not with the undeniable intelligence of the 2 capering about their mother. Not, and seeing this, Ed trembled against the freezing rock. Not with the sudden, affectionate sweep of the female as she lifted the smaller and pressed it to her, smoothing back hair from its face with a motion common to every human mother on Earth. A wonderfully tender gesture. What were they? He couldn't be certain, but he thought he heard a faint gurgle or laughter from the female, cuddling the small one. And the sound stirred him strangely. Dr. Schenk had assured him that no animal was capable of genuine laughter. But they laughed, those 3, and, hearing it, watching the mother tickling the younger one, watching its delighted squirming, Ed knew that in that marvelous little grouping below, perfectly lighted, perfectly staged, he was privileged to observe one of the Earth's most guarded secrets. He should get started, shooting his pictures. Afterwards, he would stun the group into unconsciousness with the gas gun and then send the Sherpa back down for Dr. Schenk and the others. Clouds were massing, immensities of blue-black. Already the first few flakes of snow, huge and wet, drifted against his face. But for a long moment more, he remained motionless, oddly unwilling to do anything to destroy the harmony, the purity of the scene below, so vividly etched in the brilliant light and shadow. The female, child slung casually on one hip, stood erect, hand shading her eyes, and Ed grinned. Artless but perfectly posed, she was looking carefully about and above, scanning the great outcroppings of rock, obviously searching for something. Then she paused. She was staring directly at him. Ed froze, even though he knew he was perfectly concealed by the deep shadows of the high cliff behind him. She was still looking directly at him, and then slowly her hand came up. She waved. He shivered uncontrollably in the biting wind, trying to remain motionless. The 2 young ones suddenly began to jump up and down and show every evidence of joy. And suddenly, Ed knew. He turned slowly, very slowly, and with the sensation of a freezing knife plunging deeply into his chest, he saw the male less than 5 yards away. It was huge. The gas gun was hopelessly out of reach, securely strapped to his shoulder pack. Ed stared,
knowing there was absolutely nothing he could do to protect himself before this creature, fully 8 feet tall, with arms as big as Ed's
own thighs, and eyes boring into his. There was a light of savage intelligence there, and something else. The creature made no move against him, and Ed stared at it, breathing rapidly, shallowly, and with difficulty, noting with his photographer's eyes the immense chest span, the easy rise and fall of his breathing, the large, square white teeth. There was long, sandy fur on the shoulders, chest, and back, shortening to off-white over the rest of the magnificent torso. Ears rather small and close to the head. Short, thick neck, rising up from the broad shoulders to the back of the head in a straight line. Toes long and definitely prehensile. They looked intently at each other, across the abyss of time and mystery. Man and what? How long, Ed wondered, had it stood there, observing him? Why hadn't it attacked? Had it been waiting for Ed to make a single threatening gesture, such as pointing a gun or camera? Seeing the calm awareness in those long, slanting blue eyes, Ed was relieved. Most certainly, if he had made a move for camera or gun, that move would have been his last. They looked at each other through the falling snow, and suddenly there was a perfect understanding between them. Ed made an awkward, half-frozen little bow, moving backward. The creature stood motionless, merely watching.